And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 108. Today we're going to be talking about the idea of architectural photography. Now, this is not a speciality of mine, it has to be said. It's something I've tended to avoid, but it is something that quite a few regular viewers have been asking me about. So, I've gone and asked my friend Klaus-Peter Kubik, or Peter as he's generally known to everyone who knows him, to give me a hand, because he does some amazing photography, and he just absolutely struck me as the first person to ask, really. So this is a kind of a change, it's a kind of development to these podcasts. Up until now, everything I've talked about has come directly from me. It's about my understanding of photography completely. But when it came to architectural photography, I just felt like I was completely afloat here. So, rather wonderfully, Peter has sent me a bunch of images and some information, which I'm going to share with you. If this works, hopefully I'll be able to find other photographers to do this with as well, and expand our knowledge together on photography. So here we are, live on YouTube. Hopefully, if you happen to be watching live, leave me a comment. Let me know you're here. Say hi. Tell me what the weather's like where you are. And we'll go with that. So yes, like I say, here we are. I can see we've got a few comments in already, so let's take a quick look. Becca says, afternoon everyone. We'll catch up after work. Alright, so after saying hello isn't here. Bat says, hi everyone. Weather is bright here in Somerset. Roy says, greetings all. Little grey here in West Yorkshire right now. Meg says, good afternoon everyone. April says, happy Mother's Day. Hi all. A windy and cool sun still to come out here in Long Island, New York. So yeah, of course, Mother's Day around most of the rest of the world, a chunk of the rest of the world. I'm not entirely sure. I know it's in the US and North America, I think. Is it also in parts of Europe? Mother's Day in the UK tends to happen in March sometime, so it's not one of those I tend to think about, but yes, you're right, I've seen a few posts going up today, so happy Mother's Day to everyone who celebrates that today. Brilliant, KPK says, good afternoon everyone from Germany. So this is Peter, so glad you could join in to watch this podcast live with us. May Britt says, good afternoon everyone from a sunny day in Copenhagen. John says, good morning from Columbus, Ohio, where we're finally having a nice day. It sounds like you've been hanging out waiting for that one. Stacy says, happy Sunday, rainy and miserable here in Hatboro, that's in Pennsylvania, and a happy Mother's Day too. Rosemary says, good morning and a happy Mother's Day from Rosemary's in Washington State, Pacific West, USA, I think. Jackie says, hello from a sunny South Africa. So that's brilliant. We've got a real, and it's Mother's Day there too. So we've got a fantastic people from all over the world here joining in, ready for this one. So, what am I going to talk about? So, yes, the idea then of... what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a bit about architectural photography. I'm going to run through the notes that Peter sent me, show you some of his images, and hopefully by the end of this, we'll all have a sort of slightly better idea of what architectural photography is. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a challenge. So anybody who wants to join in can have a go over the next couple of weeks, try and create some architectural photography photos, and then we'll do the challenge, send them in, and we'll all take a look and see what everybody's been up to. And the difference is with this one is I'm going to join in too. Generally speaking, I'm setting the challenge, but then I tend to know what it is I'm talking about with the photography. But this time, like I say, because architectural photography is something completely out with my remit, this is me kind of learning alongside you. So I'm going to join in the challenge as well, and hopefully we will all have a bit of fun with that. But what I will do is to try and give a little bit more space, I will do that for 2 weeks time rather than next week. And I'll at the end of this podcast, I'll tell you what I'm going to do for next week, but I will reiterate the challenge for 2 weeks time. If you happen to follow on Facebook, there's a Facebook group also called Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Go and join that, and that will also keep you up to date with bits and pieces. Also, second part of this podcast, I've had 4 different people send me in images for critique, so I'm going to give a bit of critique and feedback on them as well. Right, okay, so what was I going to say? Yeah, so let's make a start then with the idea of... not that one. Let's make a start with the idea of architectural photography. So, what is it? Now, architecture obviously tends to be buildings of man-made buildings, and the idea though is it's not just a case of, generally speaking, buildings in a landscape. You can do buildings in a landscape, but quite often these are more landscape photography with buildings in them. Or you can do urban photography or countryside photography. There's bits where you can certainly have buildings in them, but architectural photography is really about the idea of capturing something about the architecture, the building, the way that it shapes and interacts with humanity, or the way that we see it, or the fact that you can really use it. You can use it to explore almost kind of graphic design concepts, go abstract with it. And I think that's where really a lot of architectural photography really kind of comes into its own. If you look it up, if you go and do Google images and all this kind of stuff, you'll find that there's a lot of different ideas of what architectural photography can be, except for the fact that it does tend to kind of steer towards the stuff that grabs your eye, certainly grabs my eye, tends to be the stuff that's sort of moving into that kind of abstract level of what buildings are. So rather than buildings as something you just use in an everyday sense, they tend to be, it's how to look at it with a different eye. And this is what makes me really excited about what Peter does. So let me just go and kind of turn to my notes here. So to give you a little bit of introduction to Peter. Now, to also let you know, for anybody who's wanting to take this a little bit further, see a bit more of Peter's work, is to go to here on the YouTube video. You will find that I put into the description, I put a link to Peter's website, plus I think his Instagram account and a couple of other social media sites. So do go and take a look at Peter's stuff. Obviously not right now because we're doing the podcast. Although if you're watching the recorded version of this, you can always put this on pause, go and take a look, as long as you remember to come back. However, for the rest of you, take a look on the way back. Just see, we've got another LRK Musings. Says, good wishes from India. Please do throw some light on capturing ancient architectures. Okay, well, welcome LRK. We'll certainly have a think about that. Now, so to give you a little bit of introduction then to Peter, who has sent me the images, and I'm using the stuff that he sent me as the basis for this podcast. I asked him to tell me a little bit about how he got into photography and where it comes from. So to read what he's put, Peter says, to start with, in his childhood, he had a simple camera which gave him a lot of pleasure. When I moved to Berlin in 1977 at the age of 22, a camera always accompanied me there, with which I photographed street scenes, but also many of the painted house walls in Berlin. I made a series of more than 120 artistically designed painted house walls. I think this is where my interest in architectural photography and the artistic image design began. Over the years, I've studied photo design a bit more, read photography related books and magazines, and trained my vision. A really important point, that being basically that you train it. You train your vision by going out and doing it. And this has been Peter's speciality. He goes out again and again, constantly taking photos, constantly honing his eye and his vision. I've also participated in a lot of international and national photo contests. In the course of time, I've developed a preference for clear structures and minimalist design in my photos. These preferences have influenced the graphic composition of many of my architectural photographs. So what I will do then is he's sent various examples. So we'll go through these, talk about some of these photos, and then at the end, he's also given us a fantastic kind of half a dozen or so top tips for architectural photography, which I'll make a note of when I do the menu kind of breakdown of this video afterwards, so you can come back, look for it, and remind yourself before you get involved in doing the architectural photo challenge in a couple of weeks' time. So one of the things let me see, I need to click. That's no good. I've just managed to lose the You really would have thought after all this time, I would I would have some kind of sense of what it is I was doing, and yet somehow I still managed to have clicked on and lost what I was looking for. Right, okay, that's what I was looking for. So let's start off with then, let's drag this over here and click that there and swap over to here. So some of you who on the Facebook group will know that when I set up the little kind of event page, I use this one as the kind of header, the banner image. And so with this, lose that, close that, and so what Peter says here is the notion of to think about point of view. Try to find interesting points of view, quite often with another detail in the photo. So like you say, use a lamppost that happens to be in the photo, or put the camera very close to the ground, look upwards. So, when you look at something like this, the point of view becomes very important. This isn't just about sort of standing back and looking at a building. By looking up, what really becomes very important with this idea of looking up is essentially how the sky becomes a use of negative space. The sky becomes an important part of the way the shape becomes. So when you talk about the points, so this is one. Here's another one. So actually, I'll tell you what, I'll click onto this one first, because similarly, this is another looking up, and you've got the building, but then you've also got this lamppost going up as well. And you're by doing this is creating two different styles or two different kinds of subjects to be looking at, which are both kind of, well, they're playing off each other, really. The other thing that I will point out with both this one and this one is the really strong, powerful use of diagonals. And we've talked before at length, and for those who are fairly new to these podcasts, you can go back and find in previous podcasts various times where I specifically talk about the use of diagonals in photography, because diagonals really add energy to a picture, whereas horizontals and verticals add a kind of stability. If you think about a horizontal post, it feels like it's not going anywhere. A vertical post isn't going anywhere. A horizontal post, likewise, isn't going anywhere. But one that's at a diagonal, you're kind of half waiting for it to fall over. And as such, the diagonals tend to create more of an anticipation. And because of that, when you translate and you start using strong diagonals in your photography, they add a sense of energy and dynamism to them. And so while we're looking up here at very stable, solid buildings, there's that almost kind of vertigo-inducing sense of, that with these angles, that we could almost be falling into this photo. Similarly with this one, the diagonals create a very strong, powerful. Now, by contrast, this one here is much more about there's much more of a kind of a solid, you don't feel like this building could tip over on you at any moment. However, what Peter's done here is employed the use of leading lines very strongly. All these ridges and what have you in the foreground are all drawing your eye straight towards the building. And this building has been taken flat on, so we've got that kind of, so we've got the symmetry within it. However, for all the symmetry, it's very slightly off-center as well. So it's not absolute symmetry. And we talked before about the idea of sort of asymmetrical symmetry, the kind of symmetry but not quite. Likewise within this, you'll notice the scaffolding where the tower's being sort of fixed on the left, which isn't there on the right. So these kind of things, and not to forget actually this little leaf down in the bottom right corner, which then sort of breaks up some of the stark lines that are moving up towards it. So quite often in these little details are all little things that are kind of adding to, I mean, you and I could just sort of stand there in front of the building, whip out our phone and go click, but somehow it wouldn't have the same depth and feeling as this photo. And it's these little details, it's the use of leading lines, it's the use of finding things like the little leaf and including it in the composition, which really help to elevate a photo such as this. So that notion then of where are we? Of point of view becomes really important. So where are you standing when you're pointing the camera? Here's another one. Beautiful, beautiful sense of graphic design with this. Just, you know, a bit of light in the top left corner and all these lines just drawing you straight down. But again, it's not an absolute symmetry between the right and the lower part. These windows, these open windows, just kind of lift it and change it and kind of add this extra level of dynamism within it. So you can see also how the converging lines, as well as leading the line all the way along the buildings, create these very strong diagonal shapes as well. So while we have the verticals and the horizontals, the leading lines give us these verticals. I'll flick back for a moment, just to call in on the comments. So as we're going, feel free to leave comments if there's anything that occurs to you while I'm chatting. Drop them in the comments, and I'll try and kind of keep the conversation going. Meg Britt says amazing photo. Well, of course, having gone through 4, I'm not totally sure which one you mean. Stacy says, I love tall buildings and photographing them. Sophie says, hi. It would be great to know if there are any unbreakable rules in architectural photography. And Peter says, no rule is unbreakable. No, yes, it's true. You can do whatever you like. Now, but the question is whether it will look any good. Whether it will appeal to anybody else. Okay. Oh, nice little Peter says, couldn't describe better how Kim is doing. Oh, well, that's rather, I take the compliment. Thank you. What I'm doing here, though, is I'm tapping into what you've told me, Peter. So I greatly appreciate everything you've sent me through. Okay, so now, so that's that idea of sort of standing from a point, you know, where, you know, if you're standing under a building, looking up, even architecturally, if you happen to be on top of a building, looking down, if you're standing back, looking across. So think very strongly when you're interacting with a building. What angle, what's your point of view, where are you going to be coming at it from it? Now, another example Peter's sent in is the idea of the interesting telephoto zoom. And for this, rather than sort of take, now the ones that we've seen so far, so if we kind of flick back here for a moment, the photos here are, you know, what we're seeing is we're seeing a building and we're seeing sky around it. And the sky is helping to give us, you know, that like I said, that use of negative space, which really helps to enhance what's actually, you know, the content. But when you go into something like using a zoom, you could now here, I really love this one. I love the color scheme with this as well. The fact that we've got the blues in that building on the left and those wonderful reds and golds on the right. But then we have this statue in the foreground. Now, the thing about this photo is that you're not seeing the sky. You're not seeing the surrounds. You're not seeing the external part of the building. So by standing at a distance and having a zoom lens and then zooming in, now obviously this is much more of a cityscape. Peter lives in Berlin. So you're going to have, if you happen to live in that kind of city environment, you're going to have many more of these opportunities. Personally, I live in a small town, very small town in in rural Scotland, so we don't tend to get scenes like this so much. Having said that, I will still be having a go at this architectural challenge, so we'll then talk about a bit more about that later. But that notion of then, if you can get then the buildings overlapping each other and little details in the foreground. So another picture he's got here is the same kind of thing, where again we don't have any sky, we don't have both sides of the building, or you know. So the buildings themselves, these huge sort of skyscrapers in the background, are the backdrop, and so. Whereas if you can imagine this would look like if that was sky, this would give you a totally different kind of shot. Now this one, like I say, isn't really about diagonals so much. This is very much the verticals and horizontals, but it's layered. It's very, very layered as you go back in, you know, and there's also, and here it's creating a whole sense of all the different styles of building. I mean, we've got this, which has got these kind of frogmen type thing crawling up the wall. So obviously some really nice bit of art, a very kind of contemporary building. Then we've got this brick, old brick building, glass. Then we've got these massive towers. This looks much more like a kind of sort of Victorian style or 19th century building. And so something like this is giving us this wonderful sense of multiple styles of building all within the one space. And this would make a fantastic jigsaw, wouldn't it? You need 1,000-piece jigsaw just like this, and this would keep you occupied for 3 weeks over Christmas, just kind of constantly at it with and then another example of using the telephoto. Again, this one, is I love this. So the building is, again, we've got this huge building, which is the background. But then we've got this one in the foreground with the cross. But not just that, though. We've got these little curved bits coming in, which are probably something in the foreground, not quite in focus. But it's adding this extra texture, and it's sort of drawing our eye back in. It's sort of kind of creating like a little edge there to throw our eye back into the photo. So as we kind of move around, our eyes start moving towards the edge. This creates a barrier which kind of pulls our eye back in as well. So that idea then, I think, is a really powerful one. That notion of using, use your zoom, get into the building, but don't have the sky around it. So a couple more comments coming. Oh, VG's arrived from India. Hi VG, so glad you could make it. Oh, lots of other people saying hi to VG, who says, wow, love the lines. And April saying, love these photos, it's really giving me some good ideas. Excellent, that's exactly what we want. So another thing to be thinking of loosely while I'm talking here, like I say, Peter's got very much, most of his tend to be very much sort of cityscape kind of things. Not all of us live in cities, and like I say, there will be an architectural photo challenge to come in a couple of weeks' time. So start thinking about the kind of architecture that there is where you live. If you live in a more rural environment, if you live in, in a sort of a suburban environment, there will always be interesting architecture. I mean, round here in southwest Scotland, there are ruined castles, for example, which you don't tend to get in, you certainly don't tend to get them, say, in North America. In North America, you've got those covered bridges and some of these great big old barns, or you have, especially in the likes of New England, where you have the wood-slatted houses. Every country, in parts of a country, have their own very distinct kind of architecture. LRK, who came in earlier, was saying about, can't remember, capturing ancient architectures. Similarly, VG has also talked about, the vast number of temples and what have you in India and the problems of trying to capture them. So some of what I'm talking about here, start to think about how you might apply some of these ideas within your own settings. So if you've got access to cityscapes, great. If you don't, how might you use these in your own one? So there is still that idea of multiple buildings and zooming in and not having the outline as an example, or getting in close, right, getting down to ground level, perhaps lying on the ground, pointing your camera upwards. Are there columns? Are there towers? Are there spires that you could maybe be trying to get, and see what kind of shapes you can get looking up? So all these ideas, keep playing with them. Pat says, I wonder how they clean the figures. Oh, there's be the figures that are sort of sitting on top. Very rarely, and when they do, it will have to be a scaffolding job, I would think, Pat. Right, okay, so another aspect of this then, another thing that Peter said, is to focus on details. Very often architecture shows interesting details. Try and use the details as an eye catcher in your photo. So a couple of examples he's given of this. So let's flick back here. And so here, this is a wonderfully minimalist photo. So by coming in, and we don't know what the rest of the building is like. We don't even have a sense of what this is. But then suddenly you have these two lights down in the bottom corner with the shadows just hanging off the lights. And this kind of minimalism becomes very kind of aesthetically pleasing. So your buildings, this obviously then is a very modern building, but that ability to zoom in, to crop out what isn't deemed to be necessary, you can really find some interesting spaces. So really important part of to look for these little details, and how can you make sure that these details stand out, especially if it happens to be a particularly busy background, so or lots of busyness going on. Sometimes where you can crop out can make all the difference. Another example Peter gives is this one, and very beautifully done here. We have the contrast of the diagonals, and here, I mean, one thing to notice really, what's accentuating this wonderful kind of these diagonals here on the left is the way the shadows are, and that notion of light and the time of day and the weather setup. If you look at the way that the diagonal of the shadow here is lining up exactly with the angle that is photographed here. That isn't something that happens by accident. Okay, that's the kind of thing where one day you're out there, you're trying to take this photo, and you notice the shadows, and you notice the shadows aren't quite there, and then you start thinking, oh, I wonder when they would be. And so you then time it. You go back on another day, or you come back a couple of hours later. You hang around and wait for the right conditions. But the difference that these shadows on the left make, because they line up with that, is absolutely profound. You've only got to think about what it would be like if they didn't quite line up. You'd be looking at it, and it might still be an interesting photo, but it wouldn't grab you in quite the same way. Then what Peter's also got is we've got the contrast between the very angular here on the left, and then these round poles on the right. Also a kind of a rule of thirds style split down there. So there's this constant kind of moving back and forth, each side kind of contrasting with, but yet complementing the other side. So that notion of there's the details within the building, but there's also maybe what might be just onto one side. How can you match up something else that's happening within the photo as well? Really fascinating photo. Love that. Now, okay. Sorry, let me just take another sip of water here. Okay. All right. In response to Pat's, I wonder how they clean the figures. Peter says they've been removed by now. Is that talking about the frogmen figures? Anyway, Stacy says we have tall buildings in the centre of the city. Depending on the day, and safety can be achieved in the suburb. In the suburbs, it's old homes and barns. Yeah. VG says the vastness and minimalism taken from the tall building. John says I love a great minimalist photo. April says very unique, and it puts you and it is put in black and white. VG says an amazing click. Cool. Okay, so we've talked then about the idea of point of view, telephoto zoom, focusing in on details. The next thing that Peter says is one of the things you can quite often do is add a human, give it a little bit of context. So let's take a look now, and this here you see again that notion of whatever else is cropped out, because all we're going for is these clear, clean lines against a pale blue sky. But what a difference having these little people in makes. It suddenly gives you a sense of scale and a relatability as well. So you can play, because there's a human there, you can place yourself in that picture. You can see them looking over the edge. Looks like, this guy on the right is with his hand leaning on the rail. The guy on the left is clearly just leaning on the rail. So you think, wow, they're obviously looking at the view. We can't see what the view is. But it kind of adds an extra level of intrigue. Beautifully sitting there just inside one of these triangles as well. So that notion of just, even without the humans, this could be just an interesting minimalist photo. But when you add them in, it just lifts the whole thing to a slightly different level. So another example then is this one. Again, if you can imagine removing the human, you would still have an interesting, very kind of graphic design thing. But now you've got the person on the bike, and that really just adds this extra level and dimension to it. This one here, again, a lovely, I mean, in some ways, I mean, when I look at this scene, you know, you've got this very concrete building and this sort of metal ridged wall or lines kind of coming down. This is the kind of scene you would walk past a million times and you would never think about it. But again, as well as the human, I mean, even if you take the human out, you looking in, coming in at the diagonal, is creating all these lines and shapes within it. But look at the shadows. Aren't those shadows beautiful? The way the shadows are, you know, like this bit here, kind of coming down, and it's sort of, is that a door there? You know, I mean, also it's like a concrete block that's been put in, but we'll assume that it's a door. Now, I'm guessing probably Peter has cleaned out one or two artifacts and what have you in Photoshop as well. A guy here pushing, it kind of looks a bit like a lawnmower in some ways, but, or maybe a leaf cleaner, perhaps. The bright red then, I mean, it's a colour photo, but that acts a bit like a kind of selective colour effect. So you can see here then that the notion of, though, adding a human into it just changes the feel to it utterly. I mean, let me just show you briefly what happens if I open that with Photoshop a moment, and just I'll take the spot healing tool and just remove this for a moment, and now you look at the photo and it's still an interesting photo, but you know, what a difference. Just to give you that idea. So that's really what I wanted to, so his bit there about the notion of add a human, I think can be a really interesting bit as well. Now, I know for you people in India, certainly VG's talked a lot about the problems of Chennai and southern India is so populated, actually trying not to get a human in tends to be the real problem. In which case, fine, at that point, maybe you're sort of on the ground looking up, you're doing different techniques. But for those of you who occasionally find an empty bit of city or quiet time of the day or something like that, actually just adding in a single human or small human presence in there can really lift the photo. Okay, so April says these kind of photos can be put in several types of contests. Absolutely. Rosemary says it's so evident that Peter's practice and practice's eye is inspiring. Thanks so much for introducing us. And for anybody who's come in late, just a wee reminder that in the description part of this YouTube video, if you go to there, you will find links to Peter's website and some of his social media accounts as well. Meg says, I love the shadows on the wall. Beautiful. Excellent. Right, okay, so another aspect then. VG said, I love to photograph architecture. KPK is an expert. We'll check his website for inspiration. Definitely worth doing that. Okay, so another aspect then that Peter talks about is the notion of minimalism. He says, modern architecture often shows a minimalistic design. Try to emphasize in a photo what the architect created in a building. So, now the other thing about architectural photography is that it doesn't always have to be on the outside of the building. You can also go internally as well. And this, I mean, yes, minimalism line and gradation of white, of grey, of colour or lack of colour, quite astonishing. So again, there's that notion of what are you isolating? You know, you can look around all this space. Now, anybody who's standing in this space, they're inside the building. There's presumably going to be other things in that building. There will be people, there will be movement, there could be plants, there could be shops, there could be benches, there could be things leaning up against the wall, whatever there is. But Peter here has isolated a very specific set here. And again, use of diagonals make it really powerful, really graphic. But in terms of minimalism, just, you know, absolutely sublime. Another version here, in some ways a little bit similar to that one where we were looking at the building with that kind of L shape of, or square rather, of negative space, emphasizing the L shape of the building. Only this one, we're not following all the lines up. This is quite extraordinarily the way that it's kind of caught. And then the reflections in the window are just kind of creating more. It's such a kind of graphic design. Now, again, I would imagine that Peter would have been doing some cleaning up of stains on walls and bits and pieces in his post-processing. But the fact is, it's about spotting these. It's about spotting where the lines are and then thinking, okay, how can I isolate that? And then once I have, in the editing process, what do I need to do to really emphasize the point I'm trying to get across? What's the story? What's the narrative? And how do I make sure that? And so this, again, they're kind of absolute kind of modern, clean lines. And the colours then, very limited colour palette, which just makes it so much more effective as well. And his third one in the example of minimalism, here we're back to very strong diagonal, back into black and white. The sky here is smeared, is smoothed out. So again, what's obviously happened here is that he's using a long exposure. Either that or he's blowing it in Photoshop afterwards. But the guess being that if you're using a long exposure, again, if you've got fast moving clouds, that's quite good. If you're in daytime, you might need to use a filter, neutral density filter, in order to stop, so that you can slow your shutter speed down enough without overexposing. But that notion of looking up on a cloudy day, a really dark, dull day, you can sometimes get away with this a bit easier. Narrow your aperture absolutely as much as you can. Take your aperture down to f22. If you can go smaller than f22, even better. And then go to shutter, ISO 100, so that you're letting it gain as little light as possible, and then try and get your shutter speed to go as slow as you can. So whether it's 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, and if there's a bit of movement in the sky and the clouds are moving, they will start to smear across as well. But again, isolated elements and that little bit of movement in the sky make it really quite interesting. So yeah, that notion then of minimalism within the photography is can be some buildings. I mean, some of the temples, like the temples in India, or some of these Scottish buildings that are, you're not going to find a lot in the way of minimalism. There's a lot in the way of the carvings and the detail in the brickwork and all that kind of stuff. Different kind of photos. But modern buildings, a lot of modern buildings tend to have much more of a minimalism bit, and you can quite often isolate bits. So depending on what kind of buildings you've got near you, depending on what kind of style you want to go for, where you can find these kind of minimalist ideas, there's real opportunities to be had there. VG says that one looks like an envelope, and Peter says this one is just looking upwards. Melissa says, sorry, I'm late from North Carolina. Okay, Melissa, we'll join it. I'm glad you're here for the rest of the podcast, and when we've finished, go back to the beginning. Okay, so next part that Peter is talking about is the notion of staircases. And yeah, so we gain this idea that you don't have to necessarily be outside the building, from the inside the building. And and that notion, especially kind of slightly spiraled staircases, if you're at the top looking down or you're at the bottom looking up, sometimes you can get some really quite amazing things going on. So let's show you some of Peter's staircases. So this one I wouldn't even realise was stairs, I think. You obviously are kind of at the bottom looking up, and sort of weird kind of, it's so different. You're just kind of looking down this tunnel, really very, very abstract. This one becomes much more of a staircase, but look at the way that Peter's then got the colour gradations going through it as well. So we've got the white down the bottom, and it gets bluer as it goes up towards the sky at the top. So we know it's a staircase, we've got the rails, but he's angled himself in a particular way to make sure that you're getting the depth as you want it. This one here, I mean, there are some places which have these sort of slightly weird, it's not completely circular or it's not completely square. The architect themselves, whoever's designed this, has designed this with a particular idea in mind. And some of these staircases are designed with pretty much the idea that if you stood at the bottom and you looked up, you kind of go, wow. And so looking for these things. So again, especially, I mean, again, essentially, if you're in a small town in rural Scotland, you're not going to find many buildings high enough to actually have a staircase that go more than 2 floors. But if you have access to city environments or places where there are these high staircases, towers or clock towers maybe, you may well find interesting staircases. Always worth looking out for. Another version, so those were all looking from the bottom looking up. This one then is from the top looking down. And again, so you've got these kind of concentric circles or near circles moving down to the depths at the bottom, and your eye just gets drawn down and the circles are moving you, spiraling you down as well. So as Peter says, staircases in countless variations can be found in historic as well as modern buildings. Take photos upwards from the bottom as well as from the top floor downwards, and vary your point of view to create different and sometimes abstract-like impressions. And then there's a notion then of that notion of changing your viewpoint can sometimes kind of change the style as well. So here we've got another one where we're looking up, and that's giving us one feel. Just turning around 180 degrees and looking at it from a slightly different angle, it's still really interesting, but the mood is slightly different. There is something different about when you have the sense of, as we kind of read it from left to right or right to left, partly, well, of course, that will also depend on your culture. In Western culture, it's a left to right kind of, we move across the screen. Not all do. I mean, Hebrew, I know you read from right to left, for example. So that can sort of change where your eye starts, where it moves to. And then if we take something like this, so this is taking it from one angle. You move around a bit, you've got something different, and you move around again and you have something different again. So that, don't be afraid to experiment. Always keep kind of moving, changing your viewpoint, and sometimes just sort of stepping to the left or to the right, as little as 1 foot or a meter or something like that can make quite a profound difference. Take the photos, take more. Sometimes you won't really know what you're seeing until you're looking back at them on the computer. And I was in conversation with somebody recently about the fact that very often you don't realise the photo you should have taken until you're sitting down on the computer going through them all. So that then gives you a sense. Those are the photos that Peter sent. I hope that's kind of really inspiring, certainly really inspiring me. Getting a few more comments here. Melissa saying stunning. April says love the blue. VG says blue and white, incredible. April says creative with the palm tree. May Britt says the staircase holds looks like a foot. VG says the touch of green to the pristine white. And VG also says she's in love with every one of the photos. So basic tips then So now what I'm going to talk about is just a few basic tips that Peter has also given us about architectural photography, things to take into consideration, kind of summing up a lot of what we've been talking about for the last half hour or so. So one is try to give the objects enough free space to all sides so that you have enough room for image corrections, such as aligning skewed lines using imaging and editing software. So in that sense that I've talked before, and especially to and I remember Robert in Texas, we've talked about the idea of usually, just step back a little bit further, give it slightly wider than you think you need for the photo. Because when you come to editing it, it gives you that little bit more flexibility. So you can crop in a little bit, you can turn it slightly, you might be able to sort of come in and sort of grab the lines and widen them and kind of straighten lines a bit that, because of the angle you're at, aren't quite going where you wanted them to. So in terms of editing and getting in there and really polishing up the image with the editing, give yourself a little bit more so that you can crop in and you've still got enough space. Another piece of advice is find out in advance what time of day is favourable for optimal lighting conditions, or visit the location at different times of the day. Yeah, can't emphasize this enough, is that notion of, especially if you are shooting from outside or certain places inside, depending on where the light is coming from, is that of course the shadows change and the weather conditions will make a difference as well. So when we think about that photo, let's, as I pointed out earlier, so the likes of this one here, that those shadows are only at that angle lining up at one point during the day. 20 minutes later, 20 minutes earlier, those shadows are not going to be at that angle. So, sometimes you're looking for very, very specific light because that's what you want, a very, very specific shadow on it. But also that notion that there's a lot of buildings which change depending on, where you might get, there's multiple different opportunities depending on where the sun is and where the shadows are falling on any particular day or time of day, or for that matter, time of year. Because don't forget, that during the winter, there's less so, in India where you're kind of more on the equatorial thing, but certainly as you move further into the northern hemisphere and further into the southern hemisphere, in winter the sun is lower in the sky, so the shadows fall differently than they do in the summer, when they tend to be much more when the sun can be much higher in the sky. Pat says, I hope there were lifts so the photographer didn't have to scale all those stairs. If you're going to be an architectural photographer, you have to be fit. Generally speaking, I think most modern buildings have the lifts in them. Right, okay. Another tip that Robert says is take care of any necessary permits in good time. Now, there's a point, actually, that some buildings, some countries and some buildings, if you want to take photos of them, you actually do have to get permission for it. You can't just necessarily wander around with your camera. So it is one of those things to take a note of. Now, it will vary from country to country and it will vary from site to site. So sometimes, certainly in Britain, and I can only talk about the UK here, is I think as long as you are standing on public ground, so if you're on a pavement, on a sidewalk where anybody could be walking any time of the day, then you can point your photo at any building you like and take the photo. However, if you are on the property of the building, the property itself, you may well have to get permission to, it's not a given that you are allowed to take photos. It's up to the property owner. Now, some don't mind, some never think about it, you can get away with it, but some can get a bit funny about it. Even say photographing in shopping malls or something like that. Sometimes you need permission. And it's worth maybe just checking ahead. If there is a building or a set of buildings you want to be in the inside because they've got incredible staircases or they've got a huge atrium with where the light comes through, see if you can find out, first of all, whether you do need permission. Maybe zap off a quick email, little phone call, and you'll find out quickly enough. And sometimes just asking, everybody will say, yes, that's fine. So worth keeping that one in mind. In response to Pat's question about whether there's a lift, Peter says, take a lift and walk downwards, constantly looking upwards again and again. Yeah, that's certainly a way to do it for the slightly less fit of us. Brilliant. Melissa says buildings near airports are iffy. Yeah, actually, this is true. If you're near an airport, there are certain places like airports and what have you. There was a while, within 10 years after the whole 9/11 thing, where pretty much anybody with a camera near any kind of building, the people, it's like if you had a camera, people seem to think you're a terrorist scoping out the place and you could run into problems. I don't know whether that's eased off in certain places. Because it's not the kind of photography I usually do, it's not something I'm so familiar with. But like I say, worth double checking your permits if needed. Next point he makes is vary your point of view when shooting interior architecture, and especially with photos of staircases. Even small changes of viewpoint can have a great influence on the impression of the picture. Yeah, we were just talking about, so that notion of, step to the left, step to the right, forward, back, tilt your camera, to try the different angles, because it really does make a lot of difference. And then his final basic tip is try unusual points of view as photography directly going up the facade or placing the camera very close to the ground. And of course, the whole notion of isolating areas and things like this. So these then are fantastic tips. Thank you so much, Peter, for giving us these bits of information. Hugely appreciated. It certainly opened my eye up to the idea of architectural photography. It's something that I've never really I'm a people photographer first and foremost. And I'm an interactive people photographer rather than, say, at a distance like street photography. I like to be able to chat to the people that I'm photographing. I don't tend to be the person who chats to buildings and get much of a response from. So it's not something I've tended to consider much. Occasionally do landscape photos, and then maybe how is that building fitting in the landscape? But this is different. This is looking at buildings and thinking how you can use the shape and the lines and the negative space and intentions of the architect and these kind of things, how you can shape buildings. So because of this, like I say, what I'm going to do, and to give everybody enough time, in 2 weeks' time, so it's the 8th of May today, so that'll be the 22nd of May. On the 22nd of May, we will be having the Architectural Photo Challenge. So try and get your photos in by the Friday, so that by the 20th of May. But I've given you enough time so that for those of you who are working during the week, you will still have next weekend to go out and try some architectural photography. Come back, re-watch this podcast, make notes of ideas, go out with your camera, go out as often as you can. Try different buildings. Also, think about what's local to you. What is the kind of architecture of your region? What's unique about your architecture, which you don't get in other places in your country or other places in the world? Remember, we have a global audience here. You know that Rosemary in Washington State isn't going to be saying the same things as VG in India, isn't going to be seeing the same things as Jackie in South Africa, isn't going to be seeing the same things as Roy in Yorkshire. So we've each got our own unique kinds of architecture, and if we're going to sort of explore architectural photography, let's make the fun and share these ideas. And like I say, I will try and take some photos here in southwest Scotland as well. So I will put more details. Well, I will set up an event page for that, which I'll into the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook page. So if you're on Facebook, keep an eye out for that. Right. VG has said, we can't take any photos of government buildings here. The guards will not allow. The malls, lighthouses, endless options. Thank you for talking about this, and thanks to Peter for inspiring us. Brilliant. And April says, sounds like a plan. It sounds like, and making it fun. Cool. Right, okay, so many thanks, Peter, and just a wee reminder to everybody that inside the description of this video, if you go and click on it, there's links through to Peter's website and his other social media accounts. Do check him out, do follow him on social media. Absolutely inspiring. And and Peter says, thanks very much for presenting my images. I greatly appreciate all the time and effort, Peter, that you sending us the images, thinking about it, and giving us these tips. Hopefully you can maybe come back in a couple of weeks and see what we managed to do. And if you can join in the live chat and give any feedback, that would always be appreciated too. Cool, right. Okay, so we're about to move now onto the critique section. Just a wee reminder that if you haven't done already, do subscribe to, we've got youtube.com/Kim Ayres. Subscribe, hit the little notification bell to make sure that you know there's new videos as and when they come up. And if you would like to support these podcasts, if you find them useful, helpful, entertaining, and you would like to, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. Another thing you can do is invite your friends along. We've got, especially, tap into the wonderful skills of the likes of Peter. We've got a fantastic global community here. Let's get a few more people in to join our wonderful group. Okay. So, and plenty of people saying thank you to Peter. And, right. Let's move on then to the critique section. Now, the critique section is a place on the internet where people can send their images and hopefully get, what I try and do is give a bit of genuine feedback. One of the problems we have with photography is we take our photos and we're never entirely sure how we're doing. We tend to be very close to them, and while our friends may click like, we don't necessarily know. Maybe they're just being nice to us. We're not totally sure. So what I've had then this week is I've had 4 people send me in images. So I'm going to go through some of these. Now, first one I'm going to start with is Amanda. Now, Amanda put this one in a couple of weeks ago when I can't remember what we were doing now. We're doing a challenge or something. But anyway, there wasn't space to do critique. And she put in a couple of photos. She put in this one and this one. And her comment was, my Photoshop edits I wanted to share and get some feedback. And we kind of, they were not totally sure with the communication bit here. I did ask Amanda to try and let me know what it was she was hoping to achieve and what kind of feedback she was looking for. But she wasn't really totally sure on how to kind of describe it. Or really understand what I meant by that. And this has made it sort of slightly difficult for me to kind of give real feedback on this. I think there's a thing with photography. There's a couple of things that occur to me. On a technical level, we kind of run into a slight problem with both these photos in the fact that the quality is the print. You couldn't print these. That they are very, very poor quality. We don't have to zoom in at all to see. It's very, very noisy on this one. No real detail on this one. This one, likewise, it's very, very pixelated. So you can only just kind of make out what it is they are, and then you've placed them side by side. But I don't really know why you've chosen these ones to place them in the way that you have. You said about Photoshop edits, and I think one of the things that we often have with photography, one of the things that we tend to love about photography is that photography allows us to see the world in ways that we don't usually. I mean, we've just spent the time talking about Peter's photos, and nearly all of Peter's photos allow us to see buildings, whether buildings plural or an aspect of a building, in ways that we never usually see it, and that's part of the exciting side of it. And I think sometimes when we're editing, what happens is we've got a photo and we think, oh, that's I quite like that bit. And then we edit it and that changes from what we saw. And we kind of get a bit excited by that. And so we edit it a bit more and it changes it even further. And we get excited by that. And we edit it even more and we get even more excited by that. But for us, what we're doing each time we edit it, we're comparing it to what we previously taken. The problem is for anybody else looking at this photo is they don't know what they're comparing it to. They don't know what the original was, and they haven't necessarily followed you on the journey of where you're going. And so I think we can sometimes often end up with this idea of if you've taken a photo or a set of photos and you've lined them up and you're happy with them, then that's brilliant. Nothing wrong. You don't need my opinion or anybody else's opinion. But I think if you're then at a point whereby you're wanting somebody else to look at these photos and get something out of them that you get out of them, then you have to kind of be able to make that step out with yourself and try and be a little bit more objective. And one of the things you need to understand is that, first of all, when you take a photo, you have all the feelings and emotions and the smells and the tastes and the touches and the feel of the wind on your face and the sounds of the birds flying or the cars going past. You have all these extra experiences. The photo doesn't communicate those straight away to anybody who wasn't standing there next to you. So part of the whole journey of photography for other people to look at is trying to find ways to communicate what it is you felt. So what is it you're trying to get across? And like I say, then if you take that image and you sort of edit it and edit it and edit it, each step you're going a step further, but you're comparing to what it was with the last one, and it makes a lot more sense to you. But for anybody who wasn't there at the time, it's not necessarily making the same kind of sense. And unfortunately, I have to say that with this one as well, I don't truly understand what it is you were going for. So that makes it really difficult for me to give you feedback that can help you. And it's one of the things when people send me images for critique, I always try and say, tell me what it is you were trying to go for, or what your sticking point is, where your difficulty lies, if you can, because then that helps me to help you. If I can see where you're going, then I can give you I can give you some suggestions on how to get there better, if that helps. So I hope that I know it's not really giving you that much idea. I mean, the thing is, you can say, here's my edits, and I can go, I like them, I don't like them. That's not really helping you. But in order to be able to help you, I need to kind of have an idea of where you're trying to go. So if you want to put anything else in, Amanda, please try and give me as much feedback or as much information as you can about what it is you're doing, what you're trying to achieve, what you hope to get out of the photos, and then I'll do my best to help you. So hope that helps a little bit. Right. Okay. Right, next up then, we'll move on to Anita. Now, Anita said, I was playing with my son and his expressions, sent in this photo, and my friend's little daughter, which is this one here. Shy little lady, I think I made them too dark, and the face is too light. I feel like I'm missing something here. Well, again, Anita, it would have been slightly more helpful if you could have given me a bit more. I did ask you to send me the originals, but at no point, but in thread on the Facebook group, but you didn't acknowledge it, so I don't know whether you ever actually saw that bit or not. Again, certainly, if you're talking about editing and wanting help and feedback on the editing, it really makes a huge difference to me if you can send me the original photos as well, because then quite often that helps me to give you alternative options for the edits. So I'm afraid I can only be kind of slightly generic here. When you talk about, so in that notion of sort of talking about this picture being too dark, one of the things we can do is if we go to Photoshop and open this, in fact, I'll just close that one from Peter that we had on open earlier. One of the things you can do is if you go to the levels here, this gives us a little histogram down here of, and what we find is most of this is happening on the left side, which means most of it's in the darks, and there's quite a lot in the light which isn't really showing up, and that's quite the. Now if we move this slider to the left, what we see is it brightens everything up. Now if we move it too far, we've lost all the detail. That's no good. But if you're worried about a photo being too dark, come down here and start nudging this slider to the left a bit, and maybe that brightens it up. Now the question is what do we want brightening up? If we're wanting this lower part of say the face and the hair lightening up a bit, then we can move that up to a point whereby if we go too far, we've now lost it. So we just bring that back a bit. So we're just wanting to keep the detail there. So now we're happy with this part, but the problem is we've lost some of the detail up in the hairband and this arm here. So at that point, you can do the masking. So we turn that to black when we paint over here, and then if I just paint this, now painting out that light spot there and this bit here, a little bit there, and now what we find is that's taken out. So we've managed to lighten the picture, but not worry too much about blowing the highlights with it. Similarly, if I open this one of your son, if I go to the levels here, you can see that there's a gap here before it even starts. So if we can drag that up to here, we're still okay. The moment we go into this area, we are running the risk of losing details. And if we're wanting to keep the texture, we don't want to drag that too far. So that helps brighten up the face a bit. If you take the middle one, you kind of start bringing up a little bit more detail at the middle parts. But the thing is, because a lot of this has been darkened down to begin with, there's not a lot of detail left in the blacks. And this is where it would have been, again, useful if you could send me the originals, because then I could see how much detail was there in the beginning. This photo, I love the intense gaze of the boy coming straight into it. I do feel, though, that just cutting off the bottom of the chin feels like, I want to see the chin. It just feels like it's been sliced off a little bit, and I think just back a little bit further, or even making this a square. If you made this a square format, I think, and allowed that chin to be in there, I think it would have been a bit more. The one with the wee girl, we're not seeing the face, so it's not so much a portrait. We're seeing the mouth, and we're kind of wondering what the eyes are doing. Slightly different kind of feel to it. But this one, you're kind of feeling like you need the chin. But hopefully, Anita, that gives you a couple of wee ideas to play around with. Like I said, if you're sending something in to me again in the future with editing, please send me a copy. Email, you can either put it in the Facebook group, or you can email me. See, my web kimayres.co.uk. So just email it to kim@kimayres.co.uk. Again, with enough information to tell me what it is you're trying to do or where you feel your sticking points are, and then hopefully I'll be able to give you a reasonable amount of feedback on that. All right. Meg says, beautiful photos, well done. VG says, beautiful photos. And April says, wow, intense expression. Right, okay, now, on to Henry. Now, Henry sent in this photo. And so for this week's podcast, I would like some feedback for this image I took a couple of weeks ago of a red kite in flight. It says, I know it looks like a really good image, and I will admit I'm very pleased with how it turned out. However, I have a gut feeling deep down that there is something not quite right with the picture, and I'm not quite sure what it is. If you give me some different points or points of view on what might be wrong with the image and how I could improve it next time, it would be much appreciated, as I'm always trying to improve my apology. Always trying to improve. Apologies for choosing such a hard image to critique, but I'm just not sure what's wrong with it. Okay, well, capturing a bird in flight is always an interesting thing to try and do. Not always easy to do. If you've got a telephoto lens and it's flying over, you're moving, it's moving. Not getting it blurred is a good start. Okay. However, one of the things I asked you to send me the original. You sent me the original but it didn't seem to be any bigger than the Facebook version. And no matter how many times you tried sending me, the image you sent me was only really about 1,000 pixels wide, which, given the fact the camera you were using, I was expecting it to be bigger. So the only thing I can assume is that you've cropped in a lot with this, because when we look at this, the problem is that it becomes pixelated and it's out of focus very quickly. It feels like a much bigger photo, and then it was a tiny bird in the sky, and then you've cropped it in. And essentially the problem at that point is you've lost detail. You need to be in as close as you can if you want to have the detail. And the detail is kind of missing here. You know, as we move in here, you can see it's not in focus. We don't have these black patches here. It's all kind of blended into one color. We're not getting the feathers. So that's your first problem here, is a lack of detail. And for that, you need to be closer in. So you really need to use your zoom. You need to fill as much of the picture as you can with the bird, so that you've got as much detail. Now, to give you, I'm no bird photographer, and again, this is wildlife photography is a whole kind of area of mine. But just to give you an example, for myself, this is one I took of a red kite a few years ago. But what you can see here is that there is a lot. Now, while I did crop in a little bit, I didn't crop in anything like the amount you have. And so there is a lot more detail in the wings, in the feathers, in the face of the bird. So now in this case, I'm shooting from directly underneath. You've got it's essentially backlit by the sky. So we're also getting some interesting light coming through the feathers as well. So come back to yours. Now, but like I said, the first thing I notice is the lack of detail, and for that detail, you just have to have been further in the first place. If I open this with Photoshop and I try, and let's duplicate that, and I'll try and bring a bit of detail out of the shadows, seeing if it's possible. Let's zoom in. No, that wasn't quite what I meant to do. Zoom in a bit, and if I go to the shadows and I pull the shadows up, we're not really, you can see that it's just getting very, very pixelated. The other thing that I'm very aware of here as well is, just take that back, is as we zoom in here, you've got this purple fringing around. I'm not sure how well that's coming out. It's very strong on my screen. But we have this kind of blue-purple fringing that's going on. That's caused, that's again, that's part of the lens chromatic aberration. And one of the things you can do if you've got, I mean, in this case, in Camera Raw, quite a few, as part of Photoshop, there's quite a few softwares will deal with this. If I go to optics, I've got a thing called defringe here. And let me just zoom right in here so you can sort of see that kind of indigo blue purpley bit here. And if I take this and I move that to the slider to the right on the purple fringe here thing, you can see that that color kind of disappears a bit, and so it's allowing you to kind of remove some of that fringing that's going on. That's just a minor thing though. Another thing you could do, you can play with this a little bit, where maybe we do try and bring the shadows up a little bit. We try and create a little bit more increase the texture, increase the clarity, maybe take the shadows up a touch more, highlights down a little bit, go to the detail, a little bit of noise reduction, but increase the sharpening. So when we do that, now if we at the very least compare from that to that, we seem to have at least more detail going on, but it's very limited because we don't have a lot of detail to pull out in the first place. So that's kind of almost like the primary thing, is you need to have enough detail. Now the next thing is I would say to consider is essentially the angle of the bird. I mean, when we look at, remember what I was talking earlier with Peter's thing, that there's often stuff in the diagonals. If something's straight on, then it doesn't have such a sense of movement. If you've got it at a diagonal, there's much more of a sense of movement. And with this, the primary line is a strong horizontal. Let me just take a pencil tool here. That's the direction, it's a strong horizontal line, and then it's cut by the vertical of the wings. So that's not really creating a lot of movement as such. It's sort of almost like it's been cut out and stuck there. However, if what we were to do is rotate this and sort of make sure it's sort of, now I'm starting to crop here, so I'm going to use content aware here, and that will kind of fill in some of the sky as well. So I'm going to rotate that, and then I'm just going to drag it back to the left a little bit, because when you've got, generally speaking, now there are exceptions, but in most cases your starting point should be, if you've got something moving, you want to have more space in front of it than behind. So if somebody's walking, you want them walking into the picture. If somebody's on a bicycle, you want them cycling into the picture, unless there's a very good reason not to. And likewise, if you've got a bird, you want it flying into the picture. So if we turn it like that, just pull it back a little bit like this, and I've got content aware on, so that will fill in the sky. And now we find this. And that in itself, just tilting the image like that, has now given us more of a sense of movement, given us a sense that the bird is actually kind of moving in a direction that we want it to. So between the notion of detail and the notion of movement and diagonals, hopefully then that gives you a few ideas to play around with, Henry. So yeah, thank you for sending that one in. Right, okay. Final picture I'm going to talk about is Stacy, and then I will talk a little bit about what we're going to bring in, do for next week, and then we reminder of the challenge for 2 weeks' time. So the final one I want to talk about now is Stacy sent in this picture of a gazebo. She said, I love old gazebos as well as old houses. A few weeks ago, the neighbour across the street cut down a few trees, and I saw this old gazebo, which I hadn't seen before, as the trees were keeping it hidden. Drew my attention, kept, and it was on my agenda to try and photograph this. It's on a private driveway, so property's quite large. I walked around, took the photograph, had to remove a couple of items using Lightroom and Photoshop. Here's the finished object. Okay, so there's this wonderful wooden gazebo, obviously been there for a little while. It's not a brand new one. The wood is aged, You see some of these kind of tiles kind of coming off in the corner here. So it's a really lovely structure. So the thing is then, but what is it about the photo that what could we do to improve it? And I think in a way, part of what we're up against here is, I think the biggest problem that we have is essentially is all the trees in the background. All the trees in the background, Stacy, are kind of interfering with it. Although there is the gazebo there, we have to strain our eyes a little bit more to try and make out the shape that's actually there. And this is where the settings on your camera, if you had a wider aperture, a narrower depth of field, and maybe stood back, zoomed in, and focused on the front of the building, then the trees in the background would be more likely to be out of focus. And if they were more out of focus, it would allow the gazebo to really stand out against it somewhat. So let me just show you what I mean by this. So I will open this with Photoshop. Now, Photoshop is playing, I'll just close these ones of Anita and Henry's one, just so I can get a little bit more to play with. Now, I'll duplicate that layer. Now, Photoshop has started doing things like called neural filters. And this one's in beta. I was playing with it earlier, but there's one called depth blur. And now, why isn't it? All right, let's switch that on. Now, what this is going to do, now you can see this has sort of blurred it a bit, and I'm going to change the focal, I can change the focal distance and I can change the focal range. So the focal distance is saying, where should it be focusing? Should it be focusing on the background? Should it be focusing on the foreground? And it's using a whole bunch of clever software to try and work out which bits it's going to keep in focus and which bits it's not. So about there, maybe back a little bit more, something like that. Okay, so now we've got the front of this gazebo, and then I can change this so that it's only slightly blurred in the background or very, very blurred in the background. So I'm just going to kind of nudge that to something like that. This isn't exact. This all I'm doing here, Stacy, is just to try and give you an idea of what it would be like if you had different settings on your camera. The picture would obviously look different, but can you see that the difference between that and that now when the background is blurred, the gazebo just stands out against it? And this is one of the problems that you're always up against sometimes, is we focus on the thing we want to photograph, but how much is the background? The background needs to either be enhancing or it's interfering with the photo. So one way around that is to have a wide aperture, a narrow depth of focus, and then sometimes you can isolate it. Another way of isolating is by the light. If you happen to have a shaft of light coming down but the trees were in shadow, then it would stand out a bit more. Again, to give you a rough idea, I mean, if I was to just purely take the brightness and contrast here, and I was to take that contrast and really just move this to the right. Now what that's doing is that's kind of exaggerating the shadows and the highlights, but it actually makes it look sunnier, especially because there is actually a little bit of shadow on there. It does make me feel that maybe there was a little bit of light. Maybe, I won't up the shadow, I'll just exaggerate that a bit more. Just whack that over to that. And now, because there's sort of more light on it as well, that kind of also helps to separate it out from the background. So between the two of those, and in fact, actually, so you can see here then that this is quite busy. It's difficult to try and isolate. When you do something like this, the gazebo really stands out. So the point I really wanted to make with that one then, Stacy, is that notion of it's a really interesting gazebo. I can see why you wanted to photograph it. The question then becomes, how do you stop the background interfering with it? And basically your tools in your kit are your aperture, so what's in focus and what's not in focus, and use of light particularly as well. So between those two, hopefully that will give you a few ideas. Maybe go back, maybe try a different lens, maybe try a few different settings on your camera, and hopefully that will give you a few ideas. So thank you for sending that one in. Let me close that. And okay, VG says, good to see you back photographing, Stacy. And goes, wow, depth blur, never tried this before, changes the whole perspective. And VG enjoys the edit. April also says, wow, makes a difference blurred. VG says, I have a crop sensor. I tried to use a new feature. It does look better blurred with the background. Okay, so that's giving you an in, hopefully. Right, okay, so that kind of brings us to the end of the critique section. Just a wee reminder that if you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, and you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do that. Always appreciated. Now, next week, well, basically what's happened is I thought initially what I was going to do was next week I was going to set the challenge for the architectural photography. But in order to give everybody a real chance to do it, I've decided to set that challenge for 2 weeks' time. So that means that anybody who's working this week who wouldn't normally get the chance, you've at least got next weekend to go out and try. So now I know some of you won't be able to do it anyway, and some of you will have maybe interesting photos you can go and raid from your archives. But what I would say is really try this, and I'm going to join you in this. I'm going to join you in the architectural photography challenge. Peter's given us some fantastic examples of photos and some fantastic hints and tips and tricks and ideas, and I'm quite eager to try some of them out. So what we're going to be doing is in 2 weeks' time, that's the 22nd of May, we're going to have that podcast will be the architectural photography challenge. But do try and get your photos into me by the Friday at the latest, so that I've got time to kind of sort everything out and get that ready. So next week is an in-between week, and what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to talk about a photo shoot I did for where essentially what happened was there were these old photos of street scenes, particularly a place called Kakawan, which is a small village some 40 miles west of where I live. And what they wanted, these photos were about 100 years old or whatever, and they wanted some modern versions taken from the same place. And so I went out there with my camera to take photos of the same street, but 100 years later, from the same angle. Only it turned out to be much trickier than I thought it was going to be, not as obvious as you would think. So I'm going to show you some of those, and I'm going to talk you through some of the things that we did there. So that's what's going to be next week. Like I say, 2 weeks' time will be the architectural photo challenge. So that's us. Thank you ever so much once again to Peter for sending us these photos, giving us these tips, tricks, ideas. Certainly got me excited with this idea of the architectural photography challenge that we're going to have. And thank you to everybody who sent in the critique. And thank you to all of you who've been watching, commenting, giving me feedback, saying hi, and thanks to everybody else. And really, that's pretty much us. I look forward to seeing you all next week. And in the meantime, hopefully find you on Facebook or via email. Have a great week, and I'll see you all next Sunday. Take care. Bye-bye.